Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reben. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. One of the most satisfying things for me is when I open my Google alerts and I see that there is a new published paper that used this data as one of the primary sources, because a bunch of numbers on a spreadsheet don't mean anything to most people. But when academic researchers can take a theory, connect it to existing research, develop an argument, and then support that with data, it can create a really compelling story which can influence policy and change procedures and ultimately make schools safer. So I'm joined today by three professors from Appalachian State University, and they are all in the Department of Sociology. So I'm joined today by David Russell, Jon Gordon, and Kelly Thames. Their new paper is The New Social Roots of School Shootings, a refined constellation theory of rampage attacks. Kelly, David, and Jon, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for having us.
And before we get into the paper, I think it's great to give the audience a little bit of background on who each of you are and what led you to studying sociology. And first, why does a sociologist even have an opinion on school shootings? Because sociology is like Marxism and social theories and all of this. So David, what do you do at Appalachian State? What is sociology to you, and how did it lead you to this paper?
Yeah, that's a great question. My interest in sociology started with health and medicine and aging. The professors who trained me, we studied stress and mental health and how mental health problems are socially patterned and shaped by social roles and experiences and inequalities across the life course. That was my entry point into sociology. And so across my career, I've always studied topics related to medical sociology, to aging in the life course, to stress and mental health. And I think the point I credit Kelly for kind of wrapping me into this project and getting me interested in the topic of school shootings specifically. But I think this topic first came into my consciousness, I think, when I saw some of the statistics about the public health impact of school shootings, specifically just how many people they touch. And that Kelly and I have previously done some research on the opiate epidemic, which similarly affected hundreds of thousands of people. And so I saw school shootings as another social problem that was also a public health problem. And maybe I could lend some insight from the field of kind of the sociology of health.
And for anyone listening who's not familiar, life course is one of kind of the framework theories in sociology, which is that we have expectations on us that our life is going to follow a certain set of kind of checkpoints that we're going to reach. If you're a child, you're going to go to school, and from going to school, you're going to graduate, and then you're going to go to college, and then you're going to get a job. And once you have a job, you have a family, and all of these things need to happen in a sequential order. And if somebody falls off of that life course, it creates all of this despair and dismay, and you're lost. So I actually, originally, when I was starting my PhD in sociology, I was going to do a life course analysis of school shootings, but I ended up going in a different direction. So it's fascinating that you're grounded in that. Jon, what about you?
So I'm an urban sociologist, trained as an ethnographer from Chicago, the famous laboratory of urban sociology. And I had a childhood friend who kind of pushed me into this business and helped me make sense of some of the things that I was observing and wanted to learn more about as a Chicago public school teacher. And then when I made the career shift, I worked with the ethnography stronghold at New York University, and was advised by Colin Jerelmack during my dissertation research, which is becoming my first book project. And violence is central. I followed a group of criminalized men who micro-trafficked drugs, provided local security, engaged in extrajudicial violence in a neighborhood in Medellin, Colombia. And when David and Kelly approached me about collaborating on the project, I jumped at the opportunity, not just because I am interested in violence more broadly and gun violence specifically, but it was an opportunity to study gun violence from afar, whereas my first year of fieldwork in Medellin, first year and a half was actually the last year and a half of a war between two factions in organized crime in the city. And so gun violence was an imminent threat over the course of my fieldwork. But most incidents occurred between 2012 and 2015. So this was a nice way to continue that line of work in a way that was safer and feasible.
And Jon, outside of sociology, ethnography isn't a term or research method that a lot of people are familiar with. Can you just briefly describe what ethnography is?
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying ethnography, I think, is the method in some anthropology, areas. And in sociology, it is typically understood as similarly as participant observation, where the researcher immerses themselves in the field site, the group, the community that they are studying. And it requires time and navigating ethical dilemmas, building rapport with actual people. And so it is very different, I'd say, than the work we have been doing on this project, looking at open source data and statistical data. Ethnographers take field notes in real time in the field, go back to their room or wherever they're living at the time, and develop them into more analytical memos and build their data set, right, with each trip to the field. Over, for me, it was 45 months over the course of 7 years.
And I think just because ethnography is, again, something that people aren't really familiar with in most cases. One of the stories that really stood out to me from the start of my PhD program was a professor who wanted to study infant nutrition in rural Thai fishing communities. And you've got public health data, you've got medical data from infants, you have information about spending, you have all these different data points. But none of the data points could explain why, even with all this nutritional assistance, Thai women were using infant formula that was extremely expensive instead of their own breast milk. And it didn't make any sense from the data standpoint. But when my professor spent a number of months living in the villages and talking to women, she found out that all of these public health campaigns weren't working because the women in the villages thought that they weren't good enough, or there was some deficiency that they had, and that's why they were spending all of their money on this infant formula. Mm-hmm. So all of the data would never lead you to the type of finding that you would get from being in the field, and you would only get that really personal explanation of the finding if you were there for months and you built trust and became part of the community. And that just opened my eyes to what ethnography really is.
Yeah, you make a good point. The sort of broader perspective that statistics can provide gives rise to questions that are better answered, I'd say, through on-the-ground fieldwork data collected in real time, talking to quote unquote, real people. And, one of the advantages of sociology is that we're broad methodologically, theoretically. And so there's always opportunities for people who arrive with different methodological orientations to have a conversation that where each contribution complements the other, exactly as you just described.
And finally, Kelly, what brought you to sociology and Appalachian State?
So criminology, that's the easy answer. I was a criminology undergrad. I went to North Carolina State University and actually got a Bachelor of Science in criminology that was housed within the sociology department there. I guess I could go back a little bit farther and say that I was a little bit obsessed with true crime. And I thought that early on I was actually pre-med, and I thought that I was going to go into forensic pathology. And then I shadowed a forensic pathologist and said, no, this is not for me. So I decided to go a different direction with it. And I just fell in love with criminological theory and theory testing. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. And through my undergraduate work, I met a number of professors within the sociology department who were criminologists, and I was able to continue on in the graduate program through to PhD at NC State. Most of my work, especially early on, was focusing on violence, but structural explanations of violence. So we were interested in aggregate rates of usually homicide would be our dependent variable. And one of the reasons that is because it's an excellent measure of violence, an excellent measure of violent crime for a number of reasons. But the constellation theory I was introduced to it taking a theory construction course very early on in my graduate career. So this was probably my second year of graduate school. I took a theory construction course, and Catherine Newman and colleagues, their book was one of the books that we studied, and it was presented to us as an example of not only multi-level and contextual theory that is able to look at some of those structural factors and then nest or contextualize individual behavior and experience within different levels of that social context. But also the format of that theory was something that was of real interest in our studies of basically building theory, because the theory is presented as factors that are necessary but insufficient. So it's a theory that isn't meant to necessarily predict, but in a very true sense, understand. It provides a conceptual framework for analysis, which I was fascinated by the theory. And of course, having studied homicide, it was sort of a natural progression for me to be interested in mass violence. I did not really pick this project. It was always in the back of my mind that I wanted to either expand the theory or simply test the theory. It didn't really come up as something that I was going to see come to fruition until I had an undergraduate student who wanted to do casework as her honors thesis, case studies. She ended up getting a law degree, and she just finished her law degree, I believe, last year. But she wanted to do these case studies, and I thought this was a perfect opportunity to pick this theory back up and really start working with it. And David actually was the second reader on that committee for that honors thesis. So that's when we both jumped into actually beginning a project.
And before we jump into the paper itself, kind of one follow-up on question on that. I've had quite a few guests that either study or are police officers, and lots of police officers would start in an undergraduate criminal justice program, and they might get even a master's in criminal justice. What's the difference between criminal justice versus criminology as a branch of sociology?
So criminology, when using that term criminology, it indicates the sort of multidisciplinary focus on crime. Uh, Many sociological criminologists might try to kind of distance themselves from criminal justice, but the reality is that criminology is incredibly multidisciplinary. So while there are many criminal justice academicians who are highly theoretical and are drawing from sociological theory, which really, as you said earlier, did provide the foundation for our modern criminology, and specifically the Chicago School. Those structural explanations of crime and violence. So criminal justice in some ways is more procedural. It is more of a study of the system itself, and then sociology, of course, provides that social context and the theories of micro interactions and macro social structures that allow you to have a bit of a potentially broader study of crime and the justice system.
Yeah, and I think that segues perfectly into what this paper is, because it's a refined constellation theory of rampage attacks. And that's one of the interesting choices you make in this. Is there's school shootings, there's systemic gun violence on school property, and there's rampage attacks. So just where did this paper come from, and how did you decide that it was going to be the focus on constellation theory and then specifically those rampage attacks?
Yeah. So Kelly kind of put the bug in my ear about testing constellation theory and revisiting the theory. And I think we wanted to systematically identify, we wanted the starting point of like systematically identifying rampage school shootings. And we thought, what better way to do it than to look at a widely inclusive database like the K through 12 school shooting database, which records every instance of violence on a school campus. So it was kind of perfect for us as a starting point to make sure that we turned over every possible stone. So the last time that constellation theory was tested was in 2008. So we wanted to look at all of the rampage school shootings that took place from 2009 onward. And there were about, in the K-12 school shooting database, there were about 1,200 cases of school violence that occurred after 2009. So Kelly and I actually went through every one of those 1,200 cases and did some research on each case and identified whether it met the criteria for a rampage school shooting, which involves a current or former student. There's usually one or more victims from the attack, and the attack is usually planned in advance, and the student traverses the halls of the school, has biographical significance to them. And we identified 30 rampage school shootings that were carried out by 31 rampage school shooters. One attack in Colorado involved 2 shooters. And then it was around that time that Jon joined our team. And the next step was we wanted to conduct detailed life histories of each of the rampage school shooters. And we gathered every possible source of information we could about each of the events, law and investigation reports, news media, social media, accounts and posts. And we constructed a life history for each shooting and used that kind of as a starting point to sort of identify across each factor of the constellation theory kind of a narrative. And it was Jon and Kelly and I together, we looked at the different indicators that we were observing, and we made some refinements to the factors and indicators of the constellation theory based on the data that we were gathering. And we relabeled some factors and indicators based on the data that we gathered and the story that the data were telling us. And we did kind of a mix of quantitative and qualitative analysis. So quantitatively, we coded for the presence or absence of every indicators associated with each of the factors in the constellation theory, and looked at their correlations with other measures in the K-12 school shooting database, like lethality, the duration of the attacks, whether the shooter died during the attack. And then qualitatively, we wanted to kind of paint more of a picture of each of the factors and indicators, but also very importantly, like how they interacted with one another. Because I think one of the key points that we hope comes across in the paper is that it's the significance of any one of these indicators or factors alone doesn't tell us as much as the interactions between them, how, for instance, psychosocial issues interact with social marginalization to kind of synergistically impact the likelihood of an event like a rampage school shooting taking place.
If I could just jump into I came into the project with a clean slate, meaning I didn't know the literature on school shootings, rampage school shootings, mass shootings. My initial conversation with David and Kelly sparked my interest because, okay, I see the theoretical rationale for engaging this theory to a time period where social media has proliferated. There's an adolescent mental health decline. And, but as far as theory testing, that's not really the kind of work I do. I'm more oriented towards process. How things happen can tell us a lot about why. And so that was sort of how I approached the data collection and analysis. But, there it was this framework with which my co-authors were working, constellation theory, the 5 factors, their indicators, and it was extremely useful, right? Because as I'm becoming familiar with the literature and collecting and analyzing data simultaneously, I have, what Jack Katz would say, kind of resentfully a guiding rubric, right, for navigating the process, and the definitional criteria, and that structured our conversation. But in building the case reports, right, what I saw was an opportunity to reconstruct the biographical trajectories toward these shootings for each shooter. And David mentioned earlier the significance of calling out the interactions between factors for a deeper understanding, right, beyond just was the factor indicator present or absent. And that gave us, analytical traction on a lot of these cases, the patterns in interactions between factors across cases. And so then I was on board, I'd say, pretty quickly. And, okay, so what are we contributing to sociology? I think that's another key distinction is, sociologists demand a contribution to the literature, whether it's empirical or theoretical. And we identified ways to contribute in multiple ways, theoretically, empirically, refining the components of the theory, and then being able to say something about, again, going back to the initial conversation, something in the sociocultural landscape has changed since Newman and colleagues last applied this theory to account for rampage school shootings, and I found that really interesting.
And I would like to just pause briefly on rampage school shootings and the definitional challenges with any studies in this space. I've actually had 2 prior episodes just about defining school shootings. One was somebody's kind of survey analysis of school shooting definitions, and another was the differences in the types of shootings on campus. When you all looked through the variables in the school shooting database, I have hundreds of variables, and that is because a lot of these things are very difficult to put a label on. So, like, for the situation of the shooting, a rampage shooting could be an indiscriminate attack, which is somebody firing completely randomly. A rampage school shooting could be somebody that has specific staff members they're angry about. So one of my categories is anger over grades or discipline, because there have been shooters who only targeted staff members. And then there have also been rampage attacks linked to bullying, where there are not random victims. It's all specific people or groups of people that the shooter's targeting. And those don't even catch all of the nuance. So I have categories around, was the attack pre-planned as a yes or no? Because that can start separating some cases from others. Was it an active shooter as the FBI would define it? Was it a near miss, where, say, there was somebody with multiple weapons and multiple lots of ammunition, but only one person was wounded? Something that could have been significantly worse. Why it was rampage shooting, which I believe Eric Madsif came up with that term originally. Why was that the correct definition to kind of use for this?
Well, if I could speak to that real quick, so I appreciate your sensitivity to the importance of definition, right? We can't have a conversation about any phenomenon that generates any progress in our understanding if we're not working with a clear definition. However, and again, I'm speaking for myself here, I think a predefined definition can be advantageous, but also constraining in some ways. And so when David and Kelly exposed me to the criteria for rampage school shooting, I was skeptical. And again, I'm going to go, start with the data. And it actually made sense right away, because, some of the examples you just mentioned, David, about a student, going after the teacher or staff members because of a grade, those are revenge, right? Shootings. And I think it's easy to conflate a revenge shooting with a rampage shooting if we think about, bullying, right? The bullying indicator of social marginalization. In some instances, of course, rampage shooters have killed or shot at or targeted those who bullied them. But that is not all that happened, right? There is this indiscriminate targeting criterion that is so important because one commonality across cases is that these are attacks on institutions, right? As opposed to specific people. These are attacks on the school community. And so we borrowed from Katz's theory of intimate massacres to really kind of flesh that aspect of these events out that differentiate them from other kinds of shootings that target specific individuals, and that's it, right? So part of it is ruling out alternative definitions of specific incidents, and that actually happened. As we mentioned in the paper, in a couple cases, when a shooter only targets individuals with whom they've had interpersonal conflict or disputes, well, that's probably a revenge shooting.
So then once you had the definition that you were comfortable with, it became the next decision then is what variables you want to use and how are those variables going to be studied. You've got a monster correlation matrix with 31 different variables in it, which I'll have a picture of in the show notes. So now that you have the rampage definition, then how do you make your decisions around what variables are important?
So one of the places we started was there's kind of one finding I want to just briefly touch on. One of the things that kind of distinguished rampage school shootings that sets them apart from other forms of school violence is so rampage school shootings are more lethal. They claim a greater number of victims. They take place over a longer duration. And they're also much more likely to claim the shooter's life than other types of school violence. I think about a third of rampage school shootings claim the life of the shooter, which is much more than the other incidents of school violence. So I think, we used the theory as a guide to identify variables of interest to start, but we refine those indicators in the theory based on the life histories that we conducted. There were certain, one of the innovations of our paper was trying to actually operationalize cultural scripts. In previous work, scholars had primarily kind of qualitatively described different cultural scripts, such as fame seeking or a masculine exit. We actually tried to identify whether those indicators were present or absent, and that allowed us to also correlate different factors and indicators with the lethality of a rampage school shooting. And so some indicators jumped out as being more strongly associated with the outcomes of a rampage school shooting. And I think one of the stories there is that it kind of lends itself to the predictive power of constellation theory. So we see that when some of these indicators are present to a greater degree, that's correlated with more lethal rampage school shootings. For instance, the proportion of cultural scripts that we coded for in a school shooting, and cultural scripts are things like being obsessed with previous shootings, searching for violent concepts online, and taking part in violent gaming. We found that a greater proportion of those cultural scripts was associated with more lethal outcomes in rampage school shootings. So that was one of the rationales behind kind of how we highlighted certain variables of interest.
I think the other thing to point out, and again, this is why this collaboration is interesting, because we're all coming in with different training theoretical orientations. Yes, we had definitional criteria, but the way to define a case required identifying indicators of the factors. In other words, the process by which we defined a case and explained a case, applying the theory, proceeded simultaneously. And, so that work, right, of tracing the process by which these events unfolded, forced us to really commit to using the data to determine what variables were actually relevant within each case and across cases. And so, the constellation theory, one of the reasons why it's both useful and often criticized is because the ubiquity of these factors, right? What high school student isn't marginalized or enduring psychosocial issues, right? Or, consulting narrative resources that we might call cultural scripts. Well, most are, okay? And so that is, a way that the theory is relevant, but by taking a deep dive into the life history data and, laying out the biographical trajectory towards the attacks allows us to see factor interactions which make the relevance of these factors, their indicators, visible. And so, we're part of the, I think, conversation that we're having right now is that something that's missing is, yes, we looked at particular variables, but I would argue that the analytical approach was case-oriented, not variable-oriented.
Absolutely. I building off of what both Jon and David just spoke about, the operationalization of cultural scripts, I think, is one of the best examples of how our analysis allowed us to not only sort of, not necessarily expand, but refine the theory. And I think it really strengthens the analytical capacity of the theory. For instance, as David mentioned, most scholars who are measuring cultural scripts or the drawing on cultural scripts for people who commit mass violence are focusing on just a few, what we would consider a few variables: masculine exit, obsessions with violence or exposure to violence. But we were able to tease out and very explicitly measure and identify the fact that for rampage shooters, the shooting itself is the solution to the problems that they have been they've been experiencing. And to use the words of Jonathan Fast, it is a ceremony of violence that is meant to basically break out of a powerless state, get their power back. It's very agentic. It is the interplay or the interaction of all of the factors leading up to that point where the rampage shooting is considered to be like the solution to this individual's problems. So I think I am most proud of that addition, that refinement of the theory, is the relevance of cultural scripts to this problem that we're experiencing as a society.
And if we want to prevent the next school shooting, one of the things that we need to do is both understand the things that are very significant contributing factors. And in your table 5 that's on page 9 for anybody who's looking at this, types of things like having a stressful life event. Yes, lots of kids have stressful life events, but you could see that there is an acute, bigger than normal stressful life event here. Family problems, because if you're having a weakened family structure, as you know, we're just seeing more and more information come out about Uvalde and Oxford and Appalachia and other recent shootings. If the kid is in a very stressful situation at home, that's going to make them feel even more unstable everywhere else. And it all culminates into telling other students about the shooting, writing plans, making direct threats to others. But then the big factor, and I had a recent episode with Anna Nasur about this. She's cited in your paper as well. It's that readily accessible guns. 84% of these cases, that is not the case in every home across the country. So there are some pieces here that can be very important preventative measures. But you can also dispel some myths with this, because there are so many myths that come out around masculinity, or somebody being a loner, or somebody being bullied. Those are actually some of the less frequently occurring variables within your set. So I think that this has a lot of real power to both inform the things to look for in prevention, but also to dispel some of those longstanding myths that can lead to, say a student who's a loner and bullied to then be labeled as a threat as well.
Yeah, even considering the readily available guns, most students who are loners, who are bullied, and who have ready access to guns don't go on to do this, right? One of the patterns that emerged in the data was the socialization into gun use component, which is one of the factors we refined. And, we can say, all right, well, somebody who has more experience using guns is more likely to carry out a rampage shooting. Not necessarily, right? It's what are the meanings of gun use that build up over time for that individual who eventually goes on to carry out a shooting. And as Kelly has said, like agency, right? The sense of powerlessness. And the shooting is a solution, right? To addressing the grievances. That's why guns matter, because if you were to, remove the guns from the households of every high school student, they can still get guns, right? Guns are always accessible. And the process of acquiring guns helps, right? If they're not in the home, it helps the shooter build up their commitment to carrying out the attack, right? It's part of the process of reclaiming agency. And so really, you mentioned, if we're thinking about prevention, well, what are the grievances? Where are they coming from? To what extent can these young, mostly white men talk about them? And I think if we're, going to talk about, policy implications at some point, that's a good place to start based on what we found in doing the research.
And that fits very strongly with some of the other peer-reviewed research that we've discussed on here too. Dr. Tahir Rahman, a psychiatrist, his paper is about extreme overvalued beliefs, and when an object becomes a point of significance and identity. And in his case, in his studies of guns, where it's not a hobby, it's an obsession, where it's not something you own, it's something that defines your identity. As well as a sneak preview coming up in a couple of weeks. Anna Nasser is going to be back on this podcast to talk about her newest paper, which is titled "My Only Friend Was My Gun," and that's her life history analysis of some school shooters. That it kind of fits with that extreme overvalued beliefs, with your constellation theory analysis, that it's when your gun is your core identity and it becomes the only solution, and violence and mass violence or indiscriminate violence is then the only way that you can regain some sort of social agency. So with that, we've talked through some of the findings, some of the results. Ultimately, you want a paper like this to be something that leads to policy and action. What ways do you think that some of these findings can be operationalized as we're headed into this new school year, and there are going to be lots of people at schools across the country trying to decide whether somebody is potentially going to commit violence?
I mean, we can. David, you go ahead.
Yeah, there are two things that we come back to frequently. The first, and this kind of emerged later in our analytic process, a lot of media attention focuses on mental illness as a singular factor in rampage school shootings specifically. But we were finding that a lot of there were diminished psychosocial support infrastructures surrounding shooters, that even when they made their inner turmoil and distress known to people in their networks, their grievances, their mental health needs were not adequately addressed through counseling and family support. So that's something we noted. Psychosocial support became an inflection point for where a shooter might have regained a commitment to their attack, because other solutions that they were trying were failing, and the shooting seems to be the only solution to their problems. That was one. Psychosocial support, so strengthening psychosocial support infrastructures. The second is cultural scripts. So I think one of the notable changes since Newman last conducted an analysis of rampage school shootings is just the ubiquity of social media and the many different avenues that aspirant shooters have for identifying subcultures of. There's really interesting research about Columbiners, people who idolize the Columbine attackers, and there are one of the shooters in our study joined an Instagram group that was kind of a subculture for aspirant school shooters, and these, I think, the medium through which shooters can find community online has expanded since the last time that.
Can I just add some here? This point about psychosocial support infrastructures as an inflection point for surveillance system failure. We tend to think of surveillance systems across schools, community, law enforcement as, securitization, metal detectors, armed guards, right? Security cameras, documenting disciplinary action and, zero tolerance policies to address them. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, as I'd say, there's near consensus within this field, punitive school securitization does not work. Okay, the hyper surveillance in marginalized urban schools, where the students are predominantly people of color. Okay, we don't see rampage school shootings there. Okay, these shootings are happening in other kinds of communities with different racial compositions, socioeconomic demographics, and they're happening there. So what is the reason? And I just want to specify something, David said about why, psychosocial support enhancement. What does that actually mean? Well, a lot of the shooters in our sample, predominantly young white men, they're in pain. Okay. They're experiencing problems. And any person, okay, who is in pain or experiencing problems and can't talk about it, can't make sense of it, yeah, that's going to take a toll on their mental health, right? But mental health treatment and services are just one component of the psychosocial support infrastructure. Okay, the other component that we saw as relevant is helping these predominantly young white men make sense of their grievances, to recognize the interconnections between what they see as, personal problems, classic C. Wright Mills, and structural problems. Okay. And in our findings, what we saw was that there was no resource that held space for young white men to make sense of social problems that are too taboo to talk about and that present mental health providers or school counselors with a minefield to navigate. Okay, the racialized, gendered status, anxiety, and threat that shooters often displayed in their social media posts, their whatever digital footprint they left, that they discussed with their online, interlocutors. What do you do if you are a school counselor and a 15-year-old white boy comes into your office and says, why am I being punished for being a man and being white? Why aren't I, successful in terms of sexual conquest? Okay. Why is it that my, peers who are Black or Latino or non-white have more success romantically than me? What do you do? Right? You can't even know where to begin helping a student make sense of ideas that are racist and sexist and misogynist. And if you try to and you don't report it, then your job is at risk. And so I'd say, are trying to address a problem that's occurring under sociocultural conditions that maybe undermine that effort. We need to train, social workers, not just psychologists or mental health providers, but people in schools who are supported in having these tough conversations, recognizing, right, young white men who are experiencing these things, and giving them an opportunity to work through it with guidance. And because these individuals don't have space for doing that, well, like anybody, they're going to find another vehicle for addressing the grievances. And for young white men and boys in the United States, guns has become a vehicle for addressing those racialized and gender status threats.
And Kelly, is there anything that stood out to you in these findings, or anything that you think is an area that needs some additional research?
I think that even Newman's original analysis it made it very clear that we have a compartmentalization when it comes to surveillance. And I've had conversations with school boards and a number of groups of school administrators who are asking these same questions. What can we do? And one thing that from the very beginning stood out to me with Newman's analysis was that compartmentalization, how information is, it reaches like blockades where there needs to be a bridge to, bridge the gap between departments in the school, between the students and the staff. In other words, creating a community. And I think that's important at multiple levels of societies. The concept of community and the reality that this is something that every person who is a member of our society has some responsibility to help create. And one of the things that we were noting from the very beginning was this change in this, social structural changes in social media use and the proliferation of the internet and the ability, like both Jon and David have mentioned, to really find a niche, to find a subcultural space. I think it's important to educate the public about, well, really to dispel the myths surrounding school shootings so that we can, as a society, have conversations that really point to areas that we can address, like building communities within schools, making students feel like they are a part of the school community in a way that most schools do not, at least most schools that I have been able to observe, they don't yet succeed in creating a situation where the students feel like the staff is a part of, or that they're a part of the broader school community. Especially important in these cases because the social isolation and marginalization that these individuals are feeling, while it might not necessarily be fixed or cured by a staff member coming to them and knowing their name and showing either compassion or acceptance or what have you, but it could potentially go a long way to create those sorts of spaces and those sorts of social networks in the schools that don't just rely on students building social networks with their peers. So that's one of the things that's something that schools can, it's not an easy thing to do, but there are micro social changes that staff can make and administrators can make to begin that process of community building in schools, which seems so important, like I said, on multiple levels.
I think to build on Jon's point as well is that it's a combination of both community and opportunity, because the rampage attacks, the indiscriminate attacks, the school shootings that have the high death tolls that get a week or more of coverage on TV, these are shootings that almost always happen in poor and middle class, mostly white communities, in either rural communities or very small suburbs. Within your sample, I believe it's about 3/4 of them are in the South and Midwest, even though we have far more students that are in the major school districts in New York and Chicago and the Northeast and California. But school shootings are this really poor to lower middle class white teen problem. And something I've documented and written about for the last couple of years is the connection to Nazi identity and white nationalism. And I think that comes back to, if somebody doesn't feel that they have connection and opportunity within their school community, they're going to look elsewhere for that connection and opportunity and that validation. And that can turn into the direction of being very dark and very hateful if they're not getting it elsewhere. So the last question quickly for each of you, because I know we're a little crunched on time now, is what is one topic based on this that you would like to write your next paper about? And I'll start with you, David.
Yeah, I was really inspired by just Anasir's work on mental illness and what is the role of mental illness. And it was actually a book chapter, I think, in kind of a book about school shootings, and she wrote about what are the kind of the characteristics and what was the role of mental illness in these rampage school shootings. That's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'd like to apply within stress and mental health. In a lot of our research, we apply a stress process model, which takes into account not only stressors, but coping mechanisms, support structures. It would be interesting, I think, to apply a stress process model to put mental illness in context for rampage school shootings. That's one idea that I've been floating around with.
And it's awesome that her name has come up so many times during this, and kind of a commentary for our own lack of academic study on this topic, that a professor at Erfurt University in Germany actually has some of the most kind of profound and well researched and supported theories of gun violence in America. Jon, any single topic that jumped out that you would like to follow this up with?
Yeah, so I have been now pulled back into the sort of definitional dilemmas faced in the scholarship on gun violence more broadly, and so, and then being the ethnographer I try to be and paying attention to details, I think that, the approach we used to develop this project, rampage school shootings, can actually, I think, work to resolve some of the definition debates in the mass shooting scholarship, right? I can't remember if any of us have said it yet, but one of the great things that you're doing, right, is using such a broad definition. That's so helpful, right? Because it then allows the analysts to dive into a population of incidents and figure out what definition works for the universe of cases they want to study. And the current debates in the mass shooting literature are focusing on, quantified criteria, how many fatalities, or, should we focus on a number of casualties, meaning injured and killed, or, excluding cases that begin with, violence elsewhere at a different site. I think rampage shootings and this analytical approach provide a generative analytical strategy that can help us move past some of those definitional dilemmas. Is there a concept or a category or a subset of shooting that actually does more work, that provides more clarity than mass shootings, especially since there's no official government definition used, right?
Yep, and I'll drop a link in the show notes to episode number 6 of this podcast. So it was more than a year ago, and it was with Dr. Ben Comer at Texas Christian University on his paper, Definitional Discrepancies Defining School Shooting and Other Incidents of Gunfire Affecting Schools. And that is work that certainly needs to extend into the public realm, because as you pointed out, these are all made up terms. School shooting does not mean anything legally. Active shooter does not mean anything legally. Every federal agency uses active shooter slightly differently. So we're all just using colloquial terms here. And finally, Kelly, to wrap us up, anything stand out as a topic that you would like to dive into next?
So I think one of the things that I've become interested in, going back to grad school, I took a social networking methods course, which I found really, really interesting. And I have not yet really used that outside of that course in my career. So I am actually interested in doing some social network analysis on not only the shooters' sort of real life connections in their communities and in their schools, but also their online personas. I'm interested in kind of mapping out and seeing the potential for understanding and maybe preventative tactics or strategies that might be able to come out of some social networks analysis. One of the things that we note in the paper is that these shooters oftentimes widely publicize either their plans or threats, and it's very often publicized over social media accounts. However, if these are, generally speaking, on the whole, sort of isolated, marginalized individuals, those threats and the kind of trouble that they might indicate may not be seen by people who are actually in their real life networks. So that to me has been a point that I keep coming back to in my mind, that I think some social networks analysis could be really interesting to delve into.
Yeah, and it would be fascinating to look at that for the shooting that happened last year at Abundant Christian Life in Madison, Wisconsin, because as the details about that have come out, that was a shooting committed by a 15-year-old girl in her school, that she was having ongoing contact with at least 4 adult men who were plotting mass shootings, as well as another teen in Nashville who committed a school shooting as well. So I think it's not only seeing who are the pro-social people that somebody is having interactions with and might lead to a path to prevention, but also what is their network crossover to other points of deviance and danger. So I want to thank you all so much. I think this is one of my favorite papers that I've read so far, based on just the depth and complexity and the ways that you operationalized the school shooting data. So I thank you all so much for that. The paper is New Social Roots of School Shootings, a Refined Constellation Theory of Rampage Attacks. A link to it is in the show notes, as well as links to the websites for Kelly, David, and Jon at Appalachian State University. So thank you all so much, and I look forward to seeing your future research.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.